Speaking of leadership, I would like to take a moment to introduce one of our board members with the Justice Center, Secretary John Tilley. He currently serves for Governor Bevin in the state of Kentucky. He is the Secretary of the Justice and Public Safety Cabinet. Prior to that, Secretary Tilley was the chair of the Judiciary Committee in Kentucky's House of Representatives. He was an author of House Bill 463, which transformed much of the state of Kentucky's criminal justice system. They're receiving continuous benefits from that, and to go over the list of things that he's been an author or co-sponsor of would take far too much time. But with that, I'd like to introduce Secretary Tilley.
Well, thank you, Andy. A lot of hooey would be in that description of what you would describe. Thank you. Glad to get a post-lunch crowd. The blood sugar's up. The Israeli Parole Board study that Jake Horowitz always talks about from Pew. You could Google that and you would understand what I'm talking about, but I only have 34 minutes now to finish this panel, so I cannot go there. So Dr. Latessa, you're going to start off with us. I'm going to tell us about our panelists. Thanks for teeing up, Andrew, such an esteemed panel here. We've got to talk about what works in recidivism, how to get there, and then how to scale it up. So we're going to start with Dr. Latessa. We're going to move to Kathy Waters, who's the Director of Adult Probation in Arizona, and then Bryan Collier, who's the Executive Director of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. So Dr. Latessa, both a Bearcat and a Buckeye, you've taken your road show all over this country. Who's all listened to Dr. Latessa before? Probably the majority, the majority of the room, clearly. So how in 3 to 5 minutes can you tell us your 3 key takeaways on how to reduce recidivism? And I mean that, because we now have 33 minutes and 28 seconds.
Okay. I'm going to make an observation because, you know, the focus of this panel is a little bit on probation and parole. And one of my former doctoral students, some of you know him, Bryan who's now Assistant Director of Community Corrections down in Harris County, Houston, Texas. And he and I were talking a few months ago, and it made an observation that I think really helps fit some of the things we're seeing. He said, we've trained probation and parole officers, and this has certainly been true probably for the last 20 or 30 years. We've trained them to be referees. That's their job. And if you think about what's a referee do, right? They enforce the rules. Their job's not to tell you you did a great job, great shot. We don't see that, right? It's a referee. And the problem is we need coaches. We need probation and parole officers to become coaches. We need them to teach skills. We need them to reinforce. We need them to tell somebody when they're doing the wrong thing to help correct that, right? Sometimes a coach sits you on the bench, right? But explains to you what you have to do a better job. And I think when we look at we have programs, you know, in prisons and in the community, and they're important, but the bulk of offenders in this country are supervised either on probation or on parole. And we've got to change how our probation and parole officers work with them if we're really going to have, I think, in the long run, an appreciable effect on recidivism rate. So move them from being a referee, and it doesn't mean that the rules aren't important, but they have to become coaches.
Can you expand just a little bit on the risk principle, the need principle you talk so much about?
Well, you know, as I have always said, I learned a long time ago, if you want to reduce recidivism, you need to focus on the people likely to recidivate. And those tend to be higher risk people that have more criminogenic needs, people that have other things that get in the way of being successful. We heard a lot this morning about mental illness and other kind of barriers that they have to be addressed as well. You know, we still see a sizable percentage of people in the system that are low risk, that yes, they may have gotten in trouble and broke the law, but there are ways to deal with them without increasing the chances that they're going to stay in the system. And I think we've made headway there. The mere fact, when you look at the report, that most states utilize a risk assessment instrument. So we've kind of got that piece in place, but we don't always use it well. And that's certainly true with educating our judiciary and others. We don't even share it sometimes with people that need to see it, right? We assess people and we send them somewhere, and no one knows what their risk is other than the person that did the assessment. So I think there's still work to be done there, but we really have to just keep focusing on the people that most are concerned about, the people that kind of continue their behavior over and over again, and they're the ones that have to be the attention of our interventions.
We'll come back to that in a minute. I want to move to Director Collier now. So we've established that there is hope. We can reduce recidivism rates, and you run the largest correctional system in the country. It's its own country, and in some ways. Can you outline those successes you've had, how you've gotten there, how you've reduced recidivism in your world?
Sure. In Texas, I'll give you a 10-year story in 3 minutes. And
Yeah,
really,
3:15.
got it. Okay, I'll go the 15 seconds. But in Texas, if you go back to 2007 and you come to where we are today in 17, if you look at our recidivism rates, they've gone from 28.2% to 21%. During the same window of time, our prison population went from 156,000 to 146,000, and we've closed 8 prison facilities in the state. So what did we do back in 07 that kind of transitioned and got us to where we are today? And there's really 3 big pieces. One was in 2007, based on state population projections of prison population, which we have a legislative budget board that does our prison population projections. They anticipated that we would need beds for about 11,000 offenders over the next 5 to 6 years. So we were entering a legislative cycle. Our legislative leadership chose to set money aside just in case we had to build a couple of prisons, but instead invested about $200 million or over $200 million actually in treatment and diversion options. And the key piece there was it wasn't just throwing paint on the wall, it was actually investing in the programs that had track records already established. So they expanded those programs and put those programs in place where they weren't. The other piece that I tell everyone is almost equally as important, if not really more important, they sustained it since 07. So even when we've had really tough economic times in Texas, they didn't pull back any of that funding because they were seeing the results. The way that's affected us is our parole board utilizes many pre-release programs as a condition of release for offenders. Much of that investment went to expand and increase those programs. So as a result, we had the parole board with more confidence in the programs and wider utilization of the program, so they released more offenders on supervision. Shared with that is we had a strong parole supervision department already that had graduated sanctions and had since the early 2000s. We added additional resources there as far as outpatient services and other intermediate sanctions facility programming. So at the same time we're able to increase releasing, we're able to decrease revocations. The third thing we did about the same time is we made a significant investment in reentry. And the investment was both prison-based and parole-based, in that on our prison units, we staffed reentry staff who work with offenders that have moderate or high risk. And we do reentry planning, of course, but really we focus on the identification documents, getting them prepared, and taking care of any gaps that they have for supervision. And then the post-release reentry folks primarily work jobs, trying to hook these offenders into employment as quickly as we can upon release, because that's really where the money is. If we can get them out, get them active, get them working, we've had good success with that, and I think that's been really the 3 key pieces.
Director, tell us more specifically how you use your risk assessment tool to target the right people.
In Texas, we borrowed from Ohio. The University of Cincinnati and the Ohio Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation had developed the Ohio Risk Assessment System. We went in and essentially borrowed that system, modified it, and validated it for our Texas population, and we now use it in probation, prison, reentry, and parole supervision. And a cool thing is we have the data collected in one spot so that it feeds into all the other components of the system. So if someone comes in from parole supervision, we see what those risk levels were. We build, when someone comes into prison, an individualized treatment plan for that offender. It utilizes the TRASC risk levels that are based on criminogenic factors, but then we also do substance abuse assessments, we do screening, and then we do the addiction severity index as well. And we do sex offender treatment assessments as well, also educational assessments. We have a pretty robust school system that operates within the system, and we have about 10,000 substance abuse treatment beds. So we try to target those offenders in that individualized treatment plan based on what those assessments have told us. The parole board utilizes that individualized treatment plan to help plug in offenders to those programs pre-release.
One last question before I come back to you a little later. the kinds of caseloads that you think are responsible to actually adhere to the practices Dr. Latessa and his instruments, some of his practices would have you do?
We're very fortunate in Texas in that we have had very good parole supervision caseloads, I would say, for really the last 3 decades. We have our regular supervision caseloads are 75 to 1. Our mental health caseloads are 45 to 1. Our sex offenders are 30 to 1. Our intensive caseloads run from 25 to 1 down as low as 14 to 1. But it's not just caseloads that matter. Caseloads do matter, but you've got to have the resources for officers to be able to use. So fortunately, we've had good, strong investments in outpatient treatment for substance abuse, but also mental health, making sure that we have a strong continuity of care program in place so that when offenders come out of prison, they're plugged into priority services for mental health in the community. That's a key component that we do. And we also have sex offender therapy as well under contract so that those offenders are engaged in the treatment. But to me, caseloads are important, but equally important are the resources for those staff.
Now, Kathy, before I come to you, I want to go right back to Dr. Latessa just for a moment. I mean, one of Andy's key points is that we have twice the population on probation, or actually 4 times the population and twice the new felony crime. How do you scale that up? I mean, obviously you've got someone who's done that, but how do you, from your world, how do you scale that up to make it work in probation?
Well, I think some of the work, and it relates to overall work that you know, I spend a lot of time thinking about this because I don't have much of a life other than this stuff. And as I heard,
the Buckeyes have lost 2 games.
Well,
now.
yeah,
it's okay. It's okay.
As I heard the discussion this morning, and you know, a lot of my work over the years is focused on correctional programs, studying them, designing them. But you know, the more I thought about, you know, people and changing behavior. And if you think about most of yourselves here, most of you are here not because of some program or intervention, but you're here because of people that were in your lives that made a difference, that mattered to you. And so I think what we've got to do with probation, we can talk about caseload size, we can talk about assessment tools, but the truth of the matter is you're only going to see that individual on your caseload, you know, an hour a month, maybe 2 hours a month. I mean, that's a drop in the bucket. And so I think what we have to scale up, we have to start identifying those people in their lives that want to help them but don't know how. And my friend Chris Buckland over there did a study a few years ago in Pennsylvania, and one of the things they found was that the men and women on parole that were successful, one of the things they said that really stuck with me was that they had somebody they could go to. They didn't call him a mentor, but they had someone. And so some of the work we're doing now at Cincinnati is really trying to identify what we're calling influencers, the people in their life. And you heard it this morning on one of the sessions with the police chiefs about how sometimes their grandma wants to help them or someone else. And we're actually trying to reach out and identify these people and train them on some of those same core correctional practices that we've been training probation and parole officers on. Because I think if we're going to go to scale, we've got to have more. It's not going to be more POs that are going to do it. We can add more programs, but there's only so much capacity there. We've got to figure out how to reach into those communities and identify the people, train them, support them, and I think that'll have as big, if not a bigger effect than a lot of the so-called programs that we offer out there.
Perfect time to go to Kathy. Thank you, Dr. Latessa. You've experienced great success in Arizona doing just that, so I think everyone's wondering, how did you do it?
Well, we started out with data. We had to take a look at, back in 2004, we did a violation study, and what we found was 43% of the people going into the Department of Corrections were going in there because of probation failures. And so we did a study because the probation chiefs were very defensive and said, no, you know, most of those had to be new crimes. Well, what we found out was 80% of the 43% were technical violations. And so we really had to change our behavior and what we were doing before we could change their behavior. We had validated our risk assessment. We went methodically on a project plan that every county, because I'm the oversight, I'm kind of the central office. So the chief probation officers bought into this. The Supreme Court, in fact, our Chief Justice then at the time, made this part of her strategic agenda. And so, you had that leadership at different levels. We did a lot of training. Every county had to go through a process before they could be seen as an evidence-based process. I mean, they really had to do strategic planning, changing their policies that fit the court oversight policies. And then their officers had to be trained on all of that. And so we continued to do that. The Chief Justice, I believe, she told the legislature, the first year we will try to reduce our recidivism or our revocations to prison by 5%. The first year we hit 13%. Just those kind of small changes in what we were doing and who we were focusing on. As Ed talked about, high, medium, and low risk. When we looked at the data, we had 16% of the people on our caseloads on intensive probation. So we were really making them worse. Only 6% that were there were high risk. And so we had to realign with the risk assessment, putting the people in the right supervision strategies to begin with.
My numbers tell me here that you experienced a 29% drop in probation revocations. Does that sound familiar?
Over time,
Over
yes.
time, and a 21% drop in probation felony reconviction rates, and that's from 2008 to 2016. Does that sound about right?
Yes.
Again, is there anything you'd add? Again, I'm more interested to know how you implemented this. I know we're, again, now down to 18 minutes and 51 seconds. So, again, keeping that in mind, how did you convince counties and at that level that this needed to be done?
We actually, I have a retired criminal judge that the Supreme Court hired as a consultant. So I as a probation executive don't want to tell judges what to do. And so I had a judge who went with me, and we literally went to every county, trained stakeholders, trained the probation officers, and this went on over time. We didn't just train them one time. If we've been doing this now, you said 2008 to now, we really started using our risk assessment. The first validation happened in like 2003. So there's all these components that you have to keep doing over and over. We do booster training with our officers. We do refresher training with them. We really look at the data and the fidelity of what's going on. Do we have the right people in the right programs? Do we have the right people on the right supervision levels? And, it really took time over time. This doesn't happen overnight, but you don't do it one time. It's an ongoing process to change the culture of how you do business. And, with time, the resistors to this change will attrit out. But it's that sustaining that leadership and focusing on the right thing and continuing to follow all the right principles, we've just been successful in getting the right outcomes. And a lot of it is depending on the data, because I can sit in my office and call a chief probation officer and say, why do you have all those low-risk people on IPS? And the next thing you know, their IPS numbers come down. So it's an ongoing sharing of data, retraining. The fidelity of the programs, that's probably the toughest for us. We don't get a lot of funding for treatment with the adults. We have DTEF, which is our drug treatment. So first and second time drug offenders do not go to jail or prison in Arizona. And then that money that's collected from a tax goes for the treatment of those individuals rather than incarceration. And so we really work with the partners, with our behavioral health. Our access is what our behavioral health is called. The expansion of Medicaid was really beneficial to our population to get the treatment that they needed. So it's been ongoing.
Well, I think it would be incumbent upon me to let the group know what kind of money we're talking about, what kind of, again, percentage drop in crime, but $392 million in savings attributable to these changes and these practices. Again, crime between 2006 and 2015, the number of reported crimes fell 26% in Arizona. Again, went from having the highest crime rate in the country to the 10th highest this time, and despite some other concerns, probation revocations to jail fell in 10 of 15 counties. Again, fell in 10 of 15 counties. Pretty impressive story. So, Director Collier, I want to tee you up again. So what would be the impact in a state like yours if you could translate what you achieved with parole in probation like Arizona's done?
I think if, in Texas, the fertile ground is the probation population, clearly. And if we, and I'll just compare it to our parole population and the reduction in revocations we've had there, which is about 33%. If we had a 33% reduction in probation revocations, and probation revocations make up a third of what we receive in the prison system, half of those in Texas are technical revocations. You talk about 6,500 people, give or take, a year, which would equate to probably anywhere from 4 to 5 units and probably over $100 million in savings.
Wow. So Dr. Latessa, back to you. So what should state policymakers do with all this information?
How the hell do I know?
You can have listen, you can have the next 14 minutes to answer this. And listen, I know why he doesn't know. He usually walks around the room and captivates everybody.
I do want to say a thing about Texas, because Texas does use the Ohio Risk Assessment System, and they call it the TRAS, and Indiana uses it and calls it the IRAS. We can't let Utah use it, because it'll be your ass if Utah uses it. So I just want to let you know, all the rest of you are free to change the name, but not Utah. You have to stick with O. I think, and say this, I think the Justice Reinvestment Initiative has been has had a tremendous effect. And yes, it's been mixed in terms of what some of the states have accomplished, but this, I think, is the second summit, and I've been doing this work for 40 years, and I don't ever remember these kind of groups coming together to talk about these issues. The stakeholders, the requirement that all the stakeholders in the state participate, get on the same page, start to look at their data. I think that has been just a tremendous movement across the country. I applaud those of you that are involved. I will say this, and it was a point made, that I've never seen, whether it be a program or a jurisdiction or a state, really move forward without leadership. Leadership is absolutely essential. It's necessary. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary. And I think through things like justice reinvestment, it's really brought a lot of leadership to bear. I think, getting into the issue of, where do we go and how do we do this? If you don't have the data, you can't demonstrate what's going on. You can't look at your effectiveness. You can't do what Arizona has done. And once you have that kind of information, it's a lot easier to go to your legislature and your governor and others and advocate. Without data, you're really blind. And we're on the verge, I think, of a major revolution in terms of data analytics and what we're able to do with data in this country. And I would encourage, when I looked at those states that don't collect data on arrests and revocations, I really think that has to be remedied. If you truly want to be evidence-based, you have to have data. You have to, and you want your own data. You don't want to know what they did in Texas or Arizona. That's great, but you need to have your own data and be able to look at it. And that's where we're going in the field, is toward data analytics. And law enforcement has been doing some incredible work there. I think corrections needs to catch up, and you're not going to do that unless you fix some of those holes that we have.
You mentioned corrections and law enforcement. Those are going to be my next two questions about, after policymakers, what to do. If you want to expand on that a little bit, and also behavioral health, at the probation level, what would you advise behavioral health professionals to do? Sound like you again.
Well,
yeah. I told you could have that. I'm really not going to let you take the entire time.
I'm not going to talk about probation for a second. I'm doing some work in California in a facility. And when we first went out there, they had mental health staff and they had the probation staff, and the two never interacted, never talked unless there was an incident, and they'd call the mental health folks in. And we've started to do some work there now and created some teams. They have to staff cases together. They have to talk about their interventions and what they're doing. I think we need to start doing the same thing with our probation work. We need to embed these these folks in those systems. They need to have conferences together to handle risky folks and mental health issues. If not, those are silos. Those systems don't talk. And as a result, we have, when something goes south, it's like we would have known that, we would have done something different, but no one's talking. And so I really think we have to start embedding those folks. The mental health, substance abuse is probably done a little better, but there's a lot of work to be done there as well. And many of the folks that are serious substance abusers have mental health issues as well. So those systems really have to all be on the same page.
Let me ask you all the same question, and jump in if you feel the need before the other. Just jump as quick as you can. On that same point, behavioral health, what have you seen at either level that's impressed you, that's produced good results? What would you say to that?
Go ahead.
In
Director?
Texas, we have it's the longest acronym in state government, but it's called the Texas Correctional Office on Offenders with Medical and Mental Impairments. And we receive funding through the legislature for that arm of our agency, which buys contracts at local mental health authorities. And those contracts give our guys essentially an express lane into services. That's proven very effective in Texas for both probation and parole populations. We never have enough of it, and it doesn't mean it works for every offender, but what you find for those offenders is that continuity of care and having those offenders able to plug into those services directly and quickly through funded services that we're providing makes a huge difference for that population.
Kathy?
I think it's the ability, and someone mentioned it earlier, the ability to share information and go through the processes. And, we finally have worked through, Maricopa's our biggest county, and they work very well with their treatment provider and their integrated systems in the jail and with probation. So within their county, they share this information, and, it's more of a triage. And having them understand, someone talked about it earlier, having them understand the risk assessment, because what they're doing is very different. It's a medical model, and they have to understand the criminogenic side. And so bringing those two together, and what we've done is now establish each individual court, their presiding judge, will do an administrative order to be able to share data with what we call the REBA, which is the Regional Behavioral Health. And so they will then form MOUs for an exchange of information. Are they already in the behavioral health system? Are they seriously mentally ill? And part of that even goes back as far as using it in pretrial, so that prior to this judge making a decision about someone being released, they could notify the regional behavioral health system that this person, what are the meds that they're on? Is it safe to release the person? So I think it affects all levels of the criminal justice system, especially for us in sharing that data and information.
Well, before I go any further, the unthinkable has happened. We have covered a lot of ground, and we have 7 minutes left. And I might open the floor for a little Q&A, but I do want to recap. I think it's clear to say very simply that, again, looking at 4 times the population in probation, what we've accomplished with folks on parole, the recidivism reductions we've seen in Texas, and the great success in Arizona with probation populations, the kind of impact we can have on crime, new crime, lessening the number of victims is dramatic with using what works, what we know to work, what's been validated. And I think I would just, again, throw it out to you in our closing minutes. If there's any other closing thoughts you'd have, any takeaways that as these leaders go back to their communities, again, oftentimes we come to these and spend a day and a half, 2 days and a half, and if it's critical to take home a few things we can put to work. And I think if you were to send them home, each of you, I'm going to start with you, Ed, and if you could send them home with one key takeaway from this particular session, and we'll go down the line, and if we have any time left over, we might take a question, or might let you go a little bit early to prepare for the breakouts, either one.
Well, I want to build on what Scott had said in the panel before. The challenge today is really not around kind of what we know and what the evidence is telling us. The challenge is really around implementation. How do we take what we've learned from the research and put it into practice? And, obviously, the academic world can help with that, but that's really on you. I mean, that's really a challenge around who you hire, how you train them, how you coach them, the kind of policies you put in place. Changing a culture is very difficult. You all know that, but it can be done. It starts with leadership, but there are other pieces to it. And I think that's going to be what we wrestle with for the next few years is how do we take what we've learned about risk and need and treatment and put it into practice effectively. It's not going to be easy. That's why I think we have, we're uneven. We see some great spots where we're doing things well, but across the board we have a lot of work to do. But that's where we ought to put our energy, not on, crazy half-baked ideas that we go off on, and let's try this, and let's give them a pet in prison, and let's do all this other stuff. We really need to stay focused on how do we implement this well. You giving them a pet? We give them a pet, don't we?
Scratch the cat program. All right, yeah, sorry. Kathy.
I would say I would agree with Ed that it's the ongoing leadership and the sustainability. We were lucky enough that we had our first Chief Justice McGregor, who adopted this as part of her strategic agenda. When the Supreme Court Chief Justice says we are going to be an evidence-based court and puts that in practice. So we've now gone from one Chief Justice to the second Chief Justice. We did this in juvenile probation, so much to the effect that they're closing juvenile detention centers in Arizona. And now we're in our third Chief Justice who implemented evidence-based pretrial. So I think it starts with the leadership. And we're at a point now that when I teach evidence-based practice as the first class at our probation academy, it's the very first class. That's what they get. And so it's become part of the culture. And it's not reteaching anyone anymore or saying, I'm not going to do that, or the resistance. It's the way we do business. And then, I think lastly is educating the policymakers about what we do. In Arizona, I came from Oklahoma, which is a conservative state, and then I go to Arizona, which is a really conservative state. And so convincing even my bosses that this was the right thing to do, it took time. We did a lot of training. I think Ed came to Arizona 3 or 4 times. We had all of the he did.
Yeah.
Summer. They always have me come in the summer for trying.
But, it's the ongoing, and it has to be a high priority that this is the way we do business. And officers, you can even see the officers change. Catch somebody doing something right rather than doing something wrong. The conversations they have with offenders is very, very different than it was 15 years ago.
Director Collier.
And really more of the same. I think sustaining, making the investment in what works, sustaining it over the long haul, you get that momentum, and it changes that culture. If you checked with anyone in the Texas legislature, they'll all tell you that this part of Texas government has worked well through the programs that they've invested in. And they've done that because we've shared the success and reinforced why it's so important to keep going.
Obviously, a lot of key takeaways. For many of us, we're going to have to call on the ASPCA to find homes for all the cats and dogs we were previously working with. Nonetheless, we have 2 minutes. Again, let's thank this panel for an excellent discussion.